Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending where you're dialing in from. Welcome to the Oliver Wight Ernst & Young webinar, where today we're going to be exploring a theme that we're receiving a lot of requests about in terms of understanding what business leaders are talking about at this interesting time in world activity, especially with relation to obviously COVID. And other challenges. So my name's Andy Walker. I'm from Oliver Wight, and today I'm joined by Jocelyn Hallam, who is from Ernst & Young. Yeah, we're both going to walk you through some examples of the types of things that we're speaking to our clients about as it relates to managing their business at this time. Kind of just to set out the agenda for the next hour. With relation to what business leaders are talking about today. So we're going to just give you a temperature check. We want to ask you a question at the very beginning through a poll, which will start momentarily, but really just to get a view of how your business has been impacted by the current events, specifically around COVID. And then we're going to give you some thoughts from a survey that we undertook recently as it related to the impact to organizations of the latest COVID epidemic, and really then move into, so what are business leaders talking about today, and really how are we, how are they looking at improving their processes or improving the way that they operate their business to make them successful at this time, to enable them to respond to change. So really key for us today is to make sure we cover off, what's happening as we see it across the market, and how businesses are responding to those core changes. So welcome. I'm really looking forward to walking through the webinar with you. So I'll just hand you over to Josh from EY, who's going to take us through the first activity for you all. Thank you, Josh.
Perfect. Thanks, Andy. So if we hop on to the next page, we're just going to ask you a quick question. So you should see a poll coming up. And effectively, what we want to just understand before we dive into the content is, how have you and your business been impacted by COVID? Have you been positively impacted, not impacted at all, or negatively impacted? So we'll just give you a minute or so to answer that. And then effectively, what that will help us do is just really understand, where you guys are positioned so that we can start to, reflect that as we go through a bit of the detail. So we'll just give you a couple of minutes. Oh. So we've got about half of you have voted at the moment, so we'll just give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll move on. Okay, we're still on about half that have voted. Okay, so let's not spend too long there. We'll move on. So we can see here the overwhelming majority have been negatively impacted, which I don't think is a surprise, and I don't think is wildly misaligned to what we've seen elsewhere and what Andy will take you through in a moment. But it's interesting as well. I think we often forget, those of us that sort of are in that purple boat there tend to forget that there are businesses that have been positively impacted, and that still presents a whole potential set of challenges. It's just a different set of challenges. So we'll touch on that as we go through. But Andy, do you want to have a look at how that reflects versus what you've seen in the broader survey?
Yeah, brilliant. Will do. Yeah, thanks, Josh, and thanks everybody. So yeah, really interesting. So we did a survey recently of 248 organizations to kind of ask how they've been impacted by the by this COVID, by the latest changes that are going on globally, and similar pattern to yourselves. So 14% of you have said you were positively impacted. The overall broader survey actually said a quarter of organizations who took part had been positively impacted by COVID, whereas obviously the vast majority, so 66% of organizations had been negatively impacted, and a small proportion hadn't been impacted at all. And it is really interesting, because certainly it's easy to imagine COVID is a negative, but one of the clients I'm working with at the moment has quadrupled their business in the last 6 months, which has created them massive challenges in terms of demand volatility. But equally, I'm working with organizations who've had significant reductions in demand, which is driving significant volatility as well. And it just seems, you know, the ever-changing impact of COVID, because we're still very much mid-COVID, I think, with all the new restrictions that are coming on board. So that, you know, it's almost a dynamic measure. So yeah, great. Thank you for taking part in that. So I guess as we undertook the survey, there were three really clear themes that came out in terms of what organizations are struggling with at this time. So you can see them on the screen there. So the main one was around management of demand volatility. So that volatility could be positive in terms of which I've got much more demand than I used to have, or negativity in terms of significantly reduced, or even the volatility is in the way that my demand is being received. So I used to have an understanding of how demand would arrive through the month, but that whole curve has now been changed. So massive area that, you know, 3/4 of those 250 organizations we spoke to had an issue with as a response to that. So we're going to explore that a little bit today. Then obviously visibility and the need for more information in response to that change. So kind of a lack of visibility for the supply chain to be able to respond to that commercial demand volatility. So almost a third of organizations were struggling with that ability to integrate and understand how to respond to the demand volatility. And then approximately another third, really one of the core pieces coming out was the ability to respond in an agile way. So really recognizing, how do I respond in a way that is going to build my business for success and not respond at any cost? So, you know, the more we can respond in an agile way, the more we can benefit as an organization. So that kind of leads us to the three topics that we're going to want to share with you today in terms of what are business leaders talking about. So if we could just move on the slide. Thank you. So one is, how are we going to effectively manage demand volatility? And as I say, this is, you know, been really significant and very much, you know, the natural response of organizations and of business leaders at this time is to dive into the short term. So everybody is dropping into managing this week, next week, this month, next month, and because that's where there is almost the fire and really people responding to that. But the challenge is that we also, organizations who are doing this well and are navigating themselves well through this pandemic, you know, is around still the need to have those longer term plans that are in place. And whilst there is a lot of uncertainty with this demand volatility, and uncertainty is bad news for everybody, whether you're positively impacted or negatively impacted, arguably volatility is always a negative consequence of that. But you've almost got two choices, and this is kind of what we're talking with business leaders about at the moment. You can either choose to manage it and think about it through a formal process to help guide and align the organization together behind a set of numbers, or you can be a victim to it and be lost in that victim mentality. So really one of the key areas to focus on as we're trying to manage this demand volatility is really to be clear on what are the assumptions that you as a business are making. So I'm doing some work at the moment with an organization who has pubs, restaurants, and serves the hospitality industry, which certainly in the UK market is massively impacted almost on a daily basis by changes to regulations, changes to when they can open, when they have to close. And despite that massive volatility being injected on them by regulations and government, you know, they're having to make internal assumptions so that they can, as a leadership team and as a broader organization, align behind their latest view of what the future is going to look like and their latest view of what's going to be happening over the next few months, but actually out over the next 3 years. And when's the recovery going to be coming? And really for them, enabling them to get behind that one set of assumptions, and that as an organization, rather than everybody or every account manager or every part of every channel within their demand planning activity, by having common and assumptions that are being used to drive an understanding of what they believe will be true, is enabling them to create that common demand plan, commercial plan that the organization and supply chain can then effectively utilize to be able to drive the rest of the business and make choices. Because whilst obviously there is more uncertainty and we realize that uncertainty in the short term, we have to look longer term and say fundamentally, what does this significant change to our business mean structurally? What does it mean we need to do with relation to our property, where our staff sit? What is it we need to do with relation to our capacity as we look out over the longer term? So really having that collection around assumptions, and where we have uncertainty, which is a lot at the moment, having a formal process to enable us to identify around our base case of those assumptions, where do we see there is potential volatility? So where do we have potential upside, or where do we have potential downside relative to my assumption set? So that I'm able then to move into scenario planning, because I'm not just focusing on a set of numbers or today's latest view of the future, but I'm able to take a aligned view, a consensus-driven view from the organization, enabling us to formally document where we have variability or uncertainty, and then through scenario planning, starting to make some choices and decisions to enable us to, as an organization, then really be able to make and be in control of it rather than be a victim to it. So really that whole collectivity, volatility, we cannot change. A lot of what's going on in COVID and the impact it's having to your businesses is not something you can directly control. So really our ability to, what we can control is defining the assumptions that we believe will be true for us as an organization. And then I guess just around that, so there's the formality of having a process that enables us to collaborate and come up with that one set of numbers across the commercial teams. But then being really clear on who owns and who is accountable for the creation of that statement of the phrase we would often use, the most likely outcome. So what is who owns the development and the alignment of that most likely outcome? And we need measures in place to enable us to be able to inform us as to whether our most likely outcome it was a good one or one that had flawed assumptions, so that we can then, as we go through this, keep updating our assumptions to our latest understanding of what's happening in the marketplace. So really making sure we've got transparent and collaborative behaviors within the organization is critical. So no one function, no one department in organizations who are succeeding at this time is able to save the day. It really is down to a broader leadership engagement collectively across multiple functions, aligning behind those assumptions that's really driving that dynamic and managing that volatility and that dynamic changes that are ongoing today. But again, really, I guess just to conclude this area, it's very much we have choices to make as an organization, and organizations will either be victims of or victors from this situation. So even in negative in markets where overall volatility is to the negative, that does still provide opportunities for organizations to take more market share where they're able to be collectively working on assumptions and driving an aligned view from an organization's perspective on those future business plans. So demand volatility is obviously, for me, demand volatility is something businesses struggle with regardless of COVID almost, because there's always an element of volatility. But clearly the recent survey and really even the poll that you've just done reflects the fact that there's been significant volatility at this time. So managing that in that formal way collaboratively is a key way forward.
And I'll jump in there if I may, Andy, because I think one of the other things which is very much a hot topic of conversation across our clients at the moment is, people are struggling with this demand volatility and they naturally lean towards technology answers. And I think, as per everything Andy's just talked to, technology is not going to solve this problem. It can help once you've got these things in place, and it can make them more efficient and it can accelerate. But if you haven't got these pieces in place, the best technology in the world is not going to help you solve this problem. Yeah. So it's just a watch out, I guess, that we do see a lot of people looking to technology as the only fix or the big fix or the quick fix here, and classically that doesn't work. So
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Josh. And just to say, there is as well on the webinar, on the icons that you've got, there is a questions forum or a chat forum where if any of you, as you're listening, want to ask some questions or type something in the chat, then both myself and Josh will be watching that, and so feel free to use that as we go through this as well. So that's kind of the main piece around demand volatility, and then Josh is going to walk us through the second kind of key issue that's going on at the moment around end-to-end visibility.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Andy. And I think, building on the how do you manage the demand question, visibility is key to everything we do. So, making decisions without information, we're not going to get good quality decisions. And a lot of our clients are struggling and battling with that at the moment. I think, what we've been through over the last kind of 6 months has really highlighted a lot of the gaps that people have in their data infrastructure, in their analytics, in their reporting, in their visibility. So the left-hand side here is just a couple of stats, again, giving a feel for what people are thinking. This is from a webcast poll that we actually did a while back in January. So it was in the heat of the shutdown, so to speak. The first one there in blue, so the number one concern that people told us they had was around, end-to-end visibility, specifically in the supply chain, but I think it goes beyond the supply chain as well, having that visibility to make those informed decisions. The yellow box there says, with that in mind, so given that's their number one concern, only 6% of those industry leaders were confident that they actually had the capability and the systems to do that. So this is where the technology comes in. It's around enabling all the pieces that Andy talked about in that demand management. It's about informing those conversations, those decisions, and giving you the richness that you need. The right-hand side of this visual is our sort of maturity journey. And it's an interesting one because, the aspiration is quite clear. We start with visibility on the bottom left, basic end-to-end visibility. How are we performing? Where are we leaking value? What's working? What's not working? Where do I go and give my attention? Basically, is the minimum that we need to run a business. The second piece is then around a control tower. So once I've got the visibility, I can start to get more responsive, more proactive. I can get more real time, and I can start to sort of spot and address challenges using some more advanced analytics, using some pretty fundamental kind of machine learning to help make recommendations. We then get into the digital twin view of the world, which starts to get much more advanced in terms of the technology, and we're recreating our end-to-end business effectively within that digital world. And within there, we can start to play scenarios. We can start to really use some of that advanced artificial intelligence to do a lot of the work that we are doing today. Actually, a lot of those decisions that we're making in this digital twin world, we don't really need to make, because actually with some smart technology, it can do probably 80% of those decisions, and then we can just really focus on the true exceptions, which are above and beyond the capabilities of the technology. And then we go into the real kind of top right-hand side there, which is the real digitally enabled autonomous world. So, not only are we automating a lot of what we're doing there, but we're really interconnecting our systems. So not just internally networked, but externally. So with our customers, with our suppliers, not just our first level suppliers, but back into our network. So we really understand what's going. We can predict where we're going to hit challenges. So we're not waiting for the data to tell us we've got a problem. We're proactively saying, under these conditions, we expect there to be an issue here. Let's proactively manage that so that it never happens. And you're really in that advanced world. The interesting piece around this journey, I think, though, is because that's a great aspiration. Top right, we can sit and talk about it, and most clients will say, yes, one day we would want to be there. The interesting thing is that if you look at the technology excuse me, around to do this, so there are many technologies that can do this, from sort of the big providers to the niche sort of startup technologies, but nobody is really using a single technology end to end to do this today. So I would say very few companies are in the digital twin space. Nobody's in that sort of that far right side. And I think the control tower is probably the more common place that we see people. But even within that, there's a balance, right, between how fast do I want to get to that maturity? How much is it going to cost me, and what's the value? And, you know, I spend a lot of time, particularly at the moment with clients, helping them understand, do you really need the shiniest tool in the box? What are you trying to achieve? And actually, could you get some of that just using what you've already got better? Is it a case of once you've understood the gaps that you've got, you know, different technologies do things differently in different ways. So maybe it's a combination of point solutions, or is it really an end-to-end solution? And unfortunately, the difficult thing with this is it's, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. It will depend on, you know, underlying landscape and the value you're going to get from this as well. And I think that's the challenge that our clients are struggling with. It's not, should I be on this journey? Or even, when do I start the journey, or how do I get on the journey? It's, which bit of this maturity curve should I be aiming for based on my particular business needs? And I think that's the real challenge here. So, you know, we know a lot of our clients struggle with the first step, you know, data, always a problem. And I was, you know, talking to one of our clients just a couple of weeks ago, and they had spent an inordinate amount of time trying to get just consolidated data across, you know, many markets, many business groups, etc. But actually, the reality is these days, the technology is out there, you know, the data crawlers, the AI, the machine learning is out there to make that relatively straightforward. Not saying it's necessarily quick to deploy, but it's pretty straightforward to do these days. That's not the hard bit anymore. That used to be the hard bit. You know, if we were having this discussion kind of 5 years ago, getting the data would be the hard bit. That's not the problem now. It's working out where to get the most value from that data and how far you want to push it and how much you want to spend doing that. Because let's be realistic, getting to step 3 or 4 here is not cheap. So, you know, it's that balance. And I think that for me is an interesting challenge that we're seeing, and it's definitely been accelerated. So people have been thinking about doing this, I think, for many, you know, for a long time now, but the last 6 months has really made people realize this has to be a number one imperative, because we can't run our business without this visibility. Okay.
And it's interesting, Josh, isn't it? Because I think one of the challenges is links very much to the first piece, which is around the ability to have that one set of numbers, which is driven from the commercial organization, to inform our supply colleagues to be able to start that end-to-end visibility journey. Because of course, if we don't have a common business view on what we expect our customers to be requiring over the next 2-3 years or beyond, then it becomes really difficult for our supply chain colleagues then to be able to even start this journey. Because if I don't understand my visibility, then trying to get end-to-end visibility becomes a real challenge there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the end-to-end piece there is the key, right? Because one of the other things which has switched in the last kind of 6 months is that imperative to get visibility back into supply. So not just within my network, but my supplier and my second tier supplier and my third tier supplier. So I know that, you know, when either volume picks up again, if we're seeing a downturn, or to manage new volume, if we're seeing an upturn, you know, which bit of the network is going to break first? Where are our pinch points and our constraints? Because my piece might be okay, but if somebody down further back in the supply is going to fail, then I'm going to fail. So that's another area when we talk about visibility, and that comes into kind of the digital twin view, moving more towards that autonomous piece. It's around, you know, that real end-to-end visibility, which has become super, super high priority for a lot of our clients, particularly the more complex networked ones. Okay, so let's move on. So that's the visibility piece. So we're kind of building up the picture here, and then building on that again for the third piece is about agility. So it's great if I can understand my demand. It's great if I have visibility, but this is around what do I do with that? How do I leverage all of those good things to actually make a difference in the way that I serve my customers? And there's 4 key pillars here. So the first one we've talked about already, it's transparency and visibility. So, you know, really understanding what's happening so that we can form a plan to act against it. The second one is then really around, and we call it kind of what if scenarios here, but I would say it's probably a bit broader. It's more around insights, advanced analytics, predicting where we see challenges coming, and then being able to say, okay, well, let me run some what if scenarios. So in the example I just mentioned around, looking back into those supply chains, saying, well, where is my biggest constraint point? It might be a tier 3 supplier. And then what does that mean? Let me run some scenarios on that to see what the implications on my network and my customers are. Or it could be, we've had channel shift. A lot of that's happened over the last 6 months or so. Massive shifts, particularly, in the drinks and food industry, from on trade to off trade. The home dining and drinking situations. So where we see that channel shift, we don't know if that's going to come back. What we're seeing certainly here in the UK at the moment, it's sort of coming back and then we're locking down again. So it's going to go in swings, and really mapping out, well, what does that look like? Let me model those scenarios to make sure that I understand the implications if it comes back suddenly versus if it comes back slowly, versus if this peak is a short-term peak that then goes away. What does that look like and how does that work? And again, that's one which actually is pretty easy to do these days. There's some really fantastic technology out there around, looking at analytics, looking at simulations, looking at forecast scenarios, all of that good stuff. So it's not difficult to do, but again, it's having the right tools, it's having the right technology, and it's leveraging the data appropriately. The demand management piece, again, we've talked about, so that's the third step. So, using your what if scenarios, using your visibility to then say, okay, what does that actually mean for my plans? What am I going to do in the short term? What does it mean in the midterm? And what are my options in the long term? So all the stuff that Andy talked about at the beginning. And then the third piece here is really around the supply and inventory management. So it's really around the end-to-end visibility, impact evaluation, so all that stuff around looking back into the network. But some fundamentals here around having an inventory strategy. I think a lot of our clients will think they have an inventory strategy, but actually, if you really look at it, it's kind of a one-size-fits-all. It's not really working. It's not really being followed. We've got stuff in the wrong place. We've got shortages where we shouldn't have shortages. We've got too much product where we shouldn't have too much product. And I think even more exacerbated in this, environment where demand is shifting and we do have that volatility there, having a really clear strategy around how we're going to manage to that is going to be super important. So they're kind of the 4 big steps, but I think more important as this row across the bottom, it's all the pieces that underpin that. So one of the really, really important things, which is often overlooked, is segmentation. So how are we going to understand the characteristics and the behaviors of our products, our customers, our markets, but not just how we're going to understand it, what are we going to do with that? So, if you go into any given company, they'll probably have 3 or 4 different segmentations. Some might be used, some might just be, well, we put it in a system somewhere, but we don't really know what it does, or actually it's just more of the way we talk about the products. But what we're talking about here is really having an end-to-end view of segmentation that we can use to drive the way we respond to demand changes, to customer changes, to the fluctuations we're not expecting. How do we prioritize our products, for example? In a world where we have limited capacity, because operations have changed because of the way we have to work these days, let's say, what do we prioritize? Do we have a clear strategy around that? Do we have a segmentation driving that? And then linking that into the response strategy. And I think what we often see is where we don't have that segmentation, the noise in the network gets huge. And effectively what we start to see is the disruption, the late changes in manufacturing, the expedited shipments into markets, all of that noise and cost within the system, which actually, if we had a clear segmentation, a clear strategy, then driving our response, we could limit a lot of that. So that's super important. I think the next one is data quality. I touched on it in the visibility piece, but I think, one of the things that we see these days, if you think of data quality and data management. I'll use planning as an example because it's kind of core to the orchestration, but this applies across the business, wherever you are. If you think of the way we manage data quality, we will probably have a template that says these are kind of the rules by which we set the master data, let's say. Somebody might maintain those rules. Somebody might not maintain those rules. And if we're automating our master data management, we will probably set up some RPA that takes those rules and applies them to the data. But what we're seeing is, and again, one of the clients I'm working with at the moment, just in planning, had 23,000 rules, which were expected to rise to over 100,000 given some product complexity changes coming in. You can't manage those, you can't maintain those. And if you're updating master data, managing the quality of it with poor quality rules, then you're not going to get a good outcome. And if you talk to any particular part of the business and ask them about data quality, typically they'll say it's okay. I'm doing all right. It's hard to measure, but gut feel is we're getting there. We might be about 80%, 85%. Typically, again, if you get some real machine learning, artificial intelligence tools in to do this type of refresh, which a lot of our clients are, you will realize that what you think is about 85% is probably closer to 60, 65. And the meaning, as soon as you get that improvement, the step change in performance across the whole business is huge. So if you think about it, I think of it in a really simplistic analogy. My calculator doesn't make mistakes. It's me putting the wrong information into my calculator that makes the mistakes. And if we think of our ERP systems, they're just big, very, very clever calculators. And at the moment, we're pushing stuff into them which just isn't giving the right information to enable them to do their job. And in this world where, we need to really get our machines working at their best, and quite frankly, we're spending a lot of money on those machines, right? So you invest a lot of money, you want to get the value from it, we need to have that data quality right. The client I'm working with at the moment are starting a transformation, a global supply chain transformation. And the conversations we're having is actually the first thing you have to do is get that data quality right, because you can invest a bunch of time and energy, but you'll not get the value otherwise. So super important. The other one is then process standards. So ways of working, and effectively, how are we doing what we're doing? And a lot of this comes down to behaviors as well, I believe. If I get back to the data quality, if I've got my calculator, I have to have good data to put into it, but then I have to not interfere with what it's doing. And that's a classic thing with, I guess, again, across our business, not setting up the systems optimally, interfering with the systems, second guessing the outcomes, all of that good stuff, which we do day to day with very good intentions, just drives inaccuracy across the business. And again, if we think about right back to the first piece, managing that demand variability, we have to have every piece of our system working at its best in this climate to be able to manage effectively. And if we've got pieces which aren't working because we are not using them properly, or we're not using them consistently, or it's got a bit hard and I'm going into my spreadsheet, that causes problems. So those process standards and having visibility of how we manage those is super important. And one of the big shifts we're seeing, and a lot of our clients are talking about at the moment in the metric space and how do we manage our people, excuse me, is about moving more towards those in-process measures. So don't measure me on outcomes because it's too late. If I've failed, if I've had a service problem, if I've overspent, I've missed that boat, that's a failure. Measure me on, am I doing the processes I need to do to get the right outcomes? And that shifts the mindset. And that's a huge change for companies, huge, but super important to drive much more towards doing the right things in the right way to get the right outcomes, rather than we measure on outcomes, we miss, then we're constantly firefighting and chasing our tails to catch up. Again, super important. And then the last one here is planner capability. So, this is, as we move into our digital world, the capabilities we need, so I shouldn't say planner capability, I should just say team capability, really. But we move into a world where most of our day-to-day tasks of 5 years ago, let's say, will be automated. So we move from needing, planners and transport managers and, whatever else we might need, to actually needing data scientists, to needing analysts who can code our bots, and then needing real innovative strategic thinkers who can manage those exceptions. It's not just a case, anymore of I come in, I press this button, this happens, I press it again 500 times, then I go home. It's really about, what is the next thing we need to be prepared for? What is the next level of agility we need to build into our engine? What is the system of our business? Where are we failing? Where have we got leakage? Where have we got gaps? What can we do about it? And how can we leverage technology? I work with, one of the leading consumer goods companies in this space, and they are deploying, I should say, the Gartner concept around citizen developers. And it's really amazing to see people who say, I've been in this role 18 months, and the first thing I did was I automated all of my daily, weekly tasks. It's a completely different mindset. The kind of the millennials coming through now who, coding in R and writing automation and using bots is just normal. That's, bread and butter, that's fun. Versus, 5 years ago when, that was like, oh, wow, that's, sci-fi technology, and it's moving so fast. So, in another year's time, it will be, exponentially more advanced again. So they're the big kind of agility levers that we see, and we see clients working towards. And I think, all of the pieces we've talked about today are really the journeys that the companies are on. So it's the conversations they're having, it's the decisions they're making, it's the journeys they are at various levels of maturity on. Very much, not at the end scale of this is what they've done, because, even the very, very leaders in this space will tell you, they still have a lot to do to really be as agile as they want to be. Okay.
It's interesting just because I think a lot of it, isn't it, at the moment is, certainly in organizations I'm working with, it's that need to get those leadership teams aligned on recognizing they as a team hold the solution to their challenges rather than specific functions or silos, let's say. So it's not just for supply chain to become agile so they can respond to massive variation to plans, but it's about aligning the organization kind of end to end internally to actually be driven around one set of numbers, one set of plans, and one core group of planning assumptions to then enable the organization to be able to respond agile, to be able to drive better end-to-end visibility and manage that volatility. And I think historically, so often we see supply chain being expected to be the solution. But really, as organizations at the moment, it becomes a much broader challenge to the whole leadership group to be able to move the organization forward and succeed at this time versus just specific functions.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, Andy, and it's definitely a big shift that I am feeling. Definitely in the last year that move is happening. So the transformation I'm working on at the moment is the core of it is supply chain, but we've got finance in there, we've got commercial in there, we've got the business leadership in there. It really is end-to-end integrated. And to be honest, I think, again, looking historically, that's been a nice aspiration, but it was always a little bit for a lot of our clients in the too hard to do box. So it was kind of like, let's do the we can do, and then we'll worry about bringing the other pieces in. But I think that has fundamentally shifted now to starting with the big picture, which is great, and certainly makes for much more effective transformations.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that the whole roles and responsibilities is really, I'm certainly seeing trend very much of late, really being clear on whose challenge is it that needs to be resolved, so that historically you would always see leadership teams diving down into the organization to try and be the fix, but really layering in the but who should be driving this and who should be accountable and responsible for driving the improvement, rather than that leadership group. Because the challenge often is the leadership group dives into the short-term detail, and therefore nobody is left to look at that longer-term visibility to enable you to build agility and to enable you to look at end-to-end, because everybody's too focused internally. So that the ability to really empower the organization and let the leaders lead and the managers manage is all the more important nowadays as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's where those blue circles at the bottom come in, because I think they are really, to me, if you've got clear segmentation driving your strategy, if you've got good data quality, you've got standards which are being rigorously deployed, and you've got capability in your people, it kind of takes the noise out to give the leadership the headspace to step away from the firefighting, to do all the stuff, as you say, that they should be doing, but generally don't have the time or capacity to do. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm definitely seeing a trend, you know, March, April, May timeframe, when it was all very new in terms of the shutdown and the response to that. You know, there was a natural tendency for that diving into the short term for everybody, but very much I've seen in the last 2 or 3 months, really, that starting to be that differentiation between what the leaders are talking about and what the business is talking about, recognizing the leaders are now recognizing, okay, we've got through it, we're still alive, we're doing well, or we've lost business, but we're still succeeding in the market, and then enabling them leaders to go, so how are we going to win and how are we going to succeed in the future, and let the business get on with running the business and dealing with that volatility, etc. So really interesting, just kind of seeing it, and it's interesting being alive at a time when, you know, we're in the history books almost, isn't it, as we go through this. So what we just wanted to do with everybody is just to run another poll at the end, really just to get a view of what we've talked about, which are those that resonate most with yourselves and what you're experiencing in your business. So, you know, is it around the management of demand volatility that we talked about at the beginning, and that complete, just massive variation in terms of your demand signal or your orders that are coming in from your customers? Is it for you more about that, getting that end-to-end visibility and really being able to manage outside just your own four walls, but actually start to get visibility broadly across the supply chain, so your suppliers, your suppliers? Or is your challenge around that ability to be agile and respond in an effective way to your customers? Or does more resonate with you in terms of some of the other challenges that you face? So would you say, actually, I'm facing issues, but they aren't any that relate to those first three that you talked through? Because you know, that was an extract of a poll, of a previous poll, and you know, and resonates well with what Josh and I are speaking to our clients about. But we just wanted to get a view from you on the call in terms of what resonated with you. So we're just going to open the poll, and then if you could just indicate where what you resonated with, and then we'll share that back. And okay, so votes are coming in. Thank you. Okay, just a few more. Okay, I think we'll take the poll there. Quarter of you then are saying your resonates most in managing that demand volatility, which is interesting, given that 78% of the poll that we ran back in kind of June, July timeframe talked about that. But I do wonder, actually, you know, I think the more you do these polls, that you would almost get different results as the year goes on, because volatility, there was an initial wave of volatility with I guess the unexpected lockdown that all happened within a few weeks of it even being muted. Whereas now I do think there is a lot more awareness that, you know, we are living in a dynamic world and things will change regularly. So almost businesses have started to adapt to an expectation of volatility. So the issue in itself has now moved to, as we can see here, it's actually about how do we respond to the fact that our business is so volatile. The volatility itself is more a given, and it's now about really, you know, half of you here, we're talking about the ability to create that agile supply chain in response, which Josh was just talking about. So really interesting there, whereas that was a much smaller percentage a few months ago. But I do think, Josh, I'm not sure your thoughts, but I do think these types of themes are going to be changing in themselves quite dynamically over the next 6 months as well, in terms of as organizations respond to what's happening in the market.
Absolutely, and it completely resonates with what I'm seeing. So I think, you know, we've exactly what you said, Andy. You know, we have a concept within EY where we think kind of now, next, beyond, and all the conversations we were having back in April were about now, in crisis mode. How do we just survive? How do we manage with, you know, even be it volume increases? You know, how do we get through this you know, potentially short-term disruption? Because we didn't know then, we didn't know what was happening. And I think as we move more and become more mature, now is about building for the future. And I think the realization within the world is that this kind of stuff is going to happen. This won't be the last time we have some kind of big disruption. It's not the first. It's going to become more frequent as the world kind of moves forward. So we need to make sure we are building a future where this isn't such a big crisis for us next time, and we're just built to adapt to manage it. So 100% resonates with a lot of the conversations I'm having.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Excellent. Okay, well, so that kind of brings us to the end of what we wanted to cover off on this webinar. So thank you for joining us today. There is going to be a survey for you just to complete as we conclude the webinar, really to just to get your view on how you found the session. But obviously, more information around the surveys and information is available on our respective websites. And obviously, if you have any queries or any questions, Josh and I will stay around a little bit to monitor the questions in the chat boxes. So thank you for that. And obviously, thank you for your time in joining us both today. And we wish you every success with your business in managing the volatility over the coming months.